Hey there. Tonight we are following a trail of stone that should not exist in the neat version of history most of us were given. Recently, researchers fed high-resolution scans of ancient megalithic sites into advanced AI systems, then compared the geometry, the stress distribution, the quarry signatures, the wet Euclid patterns, and the strange repeating details across continents. And what came back was not one isolated mystery, but the outline of a pattern of giant stones, impossible joined, abandoned blocks, and foundations that seem older and wiser than the civilizations that later stood upon them. If you enjoy these slow journeys into the darker corners of the ancient world, please like this video and subscribe. Then settle in. Let the room be a little dimmer. Let the shoulders unclench. We are not going to force an answer tonight. We are only going to sit near the fire and listen to the stones. They lie across the world with a patience that almost feels personal. Some wait on mountain ridges where the air is so thin that every breath feels borrowed. Some lie hidden under jungle root and damp green shadow. Some sit in deserts where the noon light turns them white and merciless. Some sleep under snow, their edges half buried, as if the earth itself has tried to tuck them back into silence. And yet, no matter where they are found, the same unease follows them. Their scale is wrong. Their precision is wrong. Their timing is wrong. They do not belong comfortably to the slow and tidy story of human progress. That tidy story says we learned in steps. A little farming, a little village life, a little architecture, a little mathematics, a little statecraft. One generation adding a brick, then another, until eventually pyramids and fortresses and systems emerged. It is a comforting story because it moves in a straight line. But the source we are following tonight begins by turning that line into something more jagged. It says the earliest layers are often the finest. The oldest stones are often the most difficult to explain. The deeper foundations seem to carry the greatest mastery, while later cultures, even brilliant ones, often build above them without ever matching them. Honestly, I have always found that inversion more unsettling than any myth about giants. Because giants are at least dramatic. Decline is quieter. Decline means someone knew how, and then someone did not. That is where the AI angle becomes so interesting. Researchers recently began using machine learning to compare megalithic sites not as separate wonders, but as one global dataset. Surface scans from Peru, quarry marks from Lebanon, block geometry from Bolivia, basalt fitting from Easter Island, foundation courses from Egypt, magnetic irregularities from North America and Siberia. When older archaeology studied these sites in isolation, each one could be explained away with a local story and a certain amount of institutional throat clearing. But when a modern model cross references them all at once, something begins to emerge that is harder to dismiss. The same signatures repeat. The same habits of stonework appear in places divided by oceans, mountains, and official timelines. The same strange silence hangs where instructions should have survived. The source opens with that silence, and I think it is the perfect place to begin. Because silence is not neutral here. These were cultures that recorded things, rituals, kings, harvests, offerings, vars, boundaries, trade, ancestors, taxes. The Inca kept memory with quipus and inherited traditions. The Romans carved their victories into the landscape itself. The Egyptians covered walls and tombs with instructions for the next world and praise for this one. Yet at the very places where the most impossible feats of stone engineering stand, the record turns thin, hésitant, or absent. No manual. No quarry log explaining how a block heavier than a modern passenger jet was cut, moved, and fitted. No account of how a wall was designed so tightly that not even a thin blade can slide into the seam. No clear memory of who first knew how to do these things. It is as though the knowledge stood in plain view, and the explanation was the part that vanished. You know that feeling when the room falls quiet right after someone has said the most important thing. That is what the historical record feels like around these stones. The source begins by sweeping us across the map. Peru, Lebanon, Bolivia, Easter Island, Montana, Egypt, Siberia. It does this quickly at first, almost like a dark prayer. One site after another. One impossible fact after another. Some stones weigh 200 tons. Some nearly 1,000. Some perhaps much more. If the Siberian estimates are even close. Some fit in polygonal patterns with a complexity that feels more like computation than crude hauling. Some are shaped with surfaces so smooth and exact that modern machinists have quietly admitted their surprise. Some lower layers look older and finer than whatever stands above them. Some abandoned blocks lie half-carved, as though a project of immense ambition stopped in the middle of a breath and was never resumed. That phrase stays with me. Stopped in the middle of a breath. Because that is how these places feel. Not ruined in the normal sense. Interrupted. And then there are the details. The strange, repeating fingerprints. Small stone knobs that serve no obvious decorative or structural role, yet appear in Peru and Lebanon and elsewhere like a signature nobody can read. Scoop marks, curved hollows in hard rock, as though stone had once been softened, pressed, or worked in a way no textbook method really captures. Magnetic anomalies near some sites. Compasses stumbling or drifting where they should behave. Unfinished monoliths too large for any known historical method to move. A pattern of lower perfection and upper decline, of old mastery and later imitation. The AI models, according to the source, were especially useful at this stage because they are very good at the kind of comparison the human mind resists after enough years of academic compartmentalization. They do not care that one wall is in Peru and another in the Pacific. They do not care that one block belongs to a culture dated one way and another belongs to a site dated another way. They only care about geometry, pattern, repetition, stress logic, cut marks, fit signatures, and statistical recurrence. And when those variables were compared across continents, the models reportedly flagged recurring architectural behavior that looks less like coincidence and more like a family resemblance. Not proof. Perhaps. We should be careful there. But family resemblance. Enough to make the old story wobble. I think the most unsettling part of the source is not even the claim of a lost civilization. It is the calmer claim underneath it that maybe we have mistaken inheritance for invention. Maybe later peoples were brilliant, yes, but also inheritors. Maybe they maintained, reused, repaired, honored, or built around something already old in their own time. Maybe history begins, at least in stone, not at the beginning, but after a forgetting. That is a very quiet kind of dread. Because if knowledge can be lost on that scale, then progress is not a ladder. It is weather. The first site the source truly settles into is Sacsayhuaman above Cusco, and it deserves that attention. Even saying the name slowly changes the rhythm of the room. You can almost feel the altitude arriving with it. Thin air, broad sky, Andes holding the horizon like broken teeth against the light. Above the city rises a fortress known as the Royal Falcon. Though the stones there do not feel like anything as light as a bird. They feel rooted, stubborn, deeply certain of themselves. From a distance, the walls zigzag in massive lines. Up close, they become something stranger. Not rows of simple blocks, but a stone puzzle of immense irregular forms, each one carved into many-sided polygons, each one pressed against the next with a confidence that seems almost unnerving. A famous stone there carries 12 sides, though many others have even more subtle angles. The seams are so close that they have become legend. Tour guides love to say you cannot fit a piece of paper between them. Perhaps that line has been used too often, but even the exaggeration is revealing. People do not stand before those walls and talk first about religion or empire. They talk about fit. The fit is what disturbs them. And the source makes an important point here. If these walls were only large, that would already be impressive. But size alone is not the problem. The problem is the combination. Enormous mass and exact fitting. Earthquake resistance and artistic irregularity. Curving convex faces that press weight outward and downward with extraordinary stability. Multiple contact points. Stones shaped as though each one already knew the shape of the stones beside it before it was lowered into place. That last part is what gives the walls their eerie intelligence. Today, if engineers wanted to achieve this kind of result, they would likely use detailed surveys, digital modeling, repeated adjustments, heavy lifting machinery, perhaps even three-dimensional simulations to distribute forces properly. The source points out that modern AI has been used to model these very interactions, showing how such polygonal fitting could outperform more rigid, rectangular construction under seismic stress. In plain language, the walls behave like they were designed by people who understood earthquake movement in a very sophisticated way. But understanding is the problem. How did anyone at such an early stage arrive at that level of practical stone intelligence, especially when later builders nearby did not fully replicate it? The source proposes a layered answer. The lower walls are older, more exact, more ambitious. The upper additions are smaller, less refined, more consistent with known Inca methods. In other words, the Inca may not have originated the deepest masonry there. They may have inherited it, strengthened it, honored it, built above it, but not begun it. If you were standing there at sunset, When the shadows stretch long across the seams, and the granite takes on that strange warm gold that hard stone sometimes carries in mountain light, I think you would feel what the source is trying to say. The walls are not primitive at all. They are mature. They feel like the product of a system that already knew exactly what it was doing. And that is where the broader mystery enters. The same style of reasoning appears elsewhere. The same impossible poise between mass and precision. The same old lower stones and later lesser copies. The same forgotten engineering with no clear written explanation. This is why the AI comparison matters. It is not only that one site is impressive, it is that many sites seem to belong to the same emotional category. They feel like survivors. Survivors of what is the question that will haunt the rest of the story. The source hints at flood, fire, rising seas, catastrophe, a shattered older world. It does not rush the answer, which I appreciate. Better to let the stones speak first. Better to stand in their company and feel the pressure of the problem. A wall in Peru. A wall in Lebanon. Machine-like fragments in Bolivia. Basalt echoes in the Pacific. Giant foundations in Egypt. Granite impossibilities in Siberia. The world starts to sound less like a collection of separate episodes and more like a single low note held across continents. So for now, we stay with that note. The first part of the story is not asking us to believe in Atlantis by bedtime. It is only asking us to notice that the stones do not behave like they belong to a simple, upward march of human skill. They behave like remnants of a chapter that official history prefers to keep separate, site by site, so that the larger pattern never fully forms. But the pattern does form, once you look long enough. And from here, the path naturally rises higher into the Andes, toward Sacsayhuaman itself, toward the monoliths of Ollantaytambo, toward those 6 towering stones and the abandoned blocks on ancient transport routes, where the source says the first clear signs of interruption appear. Not just skill, but skill abruptly broken, as if the builders stopped all at once and left the mountains holding their unfinished thought. The longer you stand among the Andean stones, the more they begin to feel less like architecture and more like memory. That is the mood the source moves into next, and I think it is exactly the right mood. Sacsayhuaman above Cusco is not simply impressive. It is disorienting. The walls do not look like the beginning of a craft. They look like the late, polished expression of one. Their lower courses carry the kind of confidence that usually comes after a long tradition of experiment, failure, refinement, and theoretical understanding. Yet the tradition itself is missing. The manuals are missing. The long developmental staircase is missing. The only thing left in full view is the answer. And an answer without its questions is always a little eerie. The AI work described in the source becomes even more interesting here. Engineers and researchers reportedly used volumetric scans, comparative image analysis, and structural simulations to model not just the dimensions of the stones, but the logic behind their placement. What they found, in the way the source tells it, was not random artistry. It was a system. Weight distribution, micro-movement under seismic stress, load transfer across irregular polygonal faces. All of it suggests planning that is both subtle and mature. A wall like this does not happen because a culture is merely strong or patient. It happens because someone understands the relationship between stone, motion, and time. That last word matters. Time. Because these walls are built for centuries, not seasons. They are built as if their makers expected the earth to shake, expected rain, expected pressure, expected the future. There is something almost tender in that severity. The stones seem to have been taught how to hold one another. You know that feeling when craftsmanship is so complete that it begins to look like instinct. That is what unsettles people at Sacsayhuaman. It looks effortless, even though the effort must have been immense. And then there are those little details that refuse to stay little. The knobs, the scoop marks, the gently convex surfaces, the way some blocks seem not merely cut, but persuaded into place. The source lingers on these, and wisely so. A civilization can accidentally build large. It can accidentally overwork a block. It can accidentally imitate beauty. What it cannot easily do by accident is repeat a series of strange, specific signatures at site after site across the world. A knob in Peru, another in Lebanon. A wall that flexes with earthquakes in the Andes, another that ignores centuries of movement elsewhere. A recurring grammar of stone without a shared accepted chapter in history. That is why the source says the walls of Sacsayhuaman do not merely stand. They accuse. Accuse is a strong word, but I think it fits. They accuse the official timeline of being too neat. They accuse the notion of slow, simple ascent of leaving too much unexplained. They accuse later builders, even skilled ones, of being heirs rather than originators. Most of all, they accuse us of mistaking survival for invention. A wall remains, and so we assume the nearest named civilization made it. But the source asks us to consider a harder possibility. What if some of the most famous ancient peoples were already living among ruins older than themselves? That possibility grows sharper at Ollantaytambo. There the setting itself seems to conspire with the mystery. The sacred valley narrows. The air bites a little more cleanly. Terraces climb the mountain in lines that still bear the logic of later Inca labor and vision. But above the more familiar masonry sits the Temple of the Sun. And what stands there changes the emotional tone of the site immediately. 6 pink granite monoliths, tall, massive, fitted with extraordinary precision. Their front surfaces gleam with a kind of deliberate finality, while behind them rougher construction appears, stone and mortar more recognizably within the grammar of known Inca techniques. The contrast is almost too perfect. It is one thing for a site to be mysterious overall. It is another for one side of a wall to look like the work of a master, and the other like the respectable effort of an inheritor trying to complete or support what he can no longer truly reproduce. That is exactly the impression the source wants us to feel. The Inca did not lack skill. Far from it. But here their skill seems to stand beside another standard and quietly concede the distance. I have always thought inherited grandeur feels more melancholy than ruins. Ruins admit loss. Inherited grandeur forces a culture to live next to a greatness it can admire, preserve, and even use, but not fully repeat. The source strengthens this by pointing to the quarries and transport routes. Some of the granite for Ollantay Tambo came from far across rugged terrain, across river, ravine, and mountain. Even imagining the logistics is exhausting. And then one finds the abandoned blocks. Half-shaped stones, transport grooves, monoliths resting along old paths as though the builders set them down only for a moment and somehow never returned. The source is excellent here because it makes interruption feel physical. You can see it. A civilization or a workshop tradition stopping mid-sentence. The AI models come back into the story at this point in a way I find particularly effective. Researchers used terrain mapping, slope analysis, and transport simulations to test conventional theories about moving these stones. Ramps, rollers, ropes, labor crews, perhaps all of it in combination. The results, according to the source, did not make the movement impossible in every case, but they did make it increasingly improbable at the highest scales and hardest routes. Not impossible. That word is often too smug. But improbably difficult in ways that multiply rather than resolve when one sees the same challenge repeated across the world. And repetition is the real villain of conventional explanation. One astonishing sight might be solved with patience and social organization. 2 perhaps. 3 perhaps. But Peru, Lebanon, Bolivia, Easter Island, Egypt, Montana, Siberia. At some point, the burden shifts. Coincidence begins feeling like laziness. The source understands that, and so it keeps building, not isolated marvel, but chorus. The Andes provide another important layer as well. Mythology. Viracocha, the great teacher who in some traditions arrives after catastrophe, bringing order, craft, and civilizational guidance. The source does not ask us to swallow such stories whole as literal biography. It asks something more interesting. What if culture-bringer myths preserve the emotional memory of a real transfer of knowledge from survivors, strangers, or inheritors of an older system? What if the figure of the teacher god is what happens when practical knowledge outlives the practical language used to describe its source? I find that deeply plausible as a human mechanism. Whether one accepts the strongest historical claim or not, if a civilization collapses and fragments, later generations may remember the returning bearers of skill not as engineers, but as divine teachers. A person who knows how to align stone, channel water, or predict celestial cycles can become very godlike in the memory of those who no longer share the method. That same pattern will matter even more later in the story, when flood myths begin gathering around the stones. For now, it already shadows the Andes. The lower walls are too good. The transport routes are too harsh. The unfinished work is too poignant. The myths of instruction arrive too conveniently around sites where instruction seems precisely what has been lost. And then there is Baalbek, waiting far away in Lebanon like a heavier echo. The source loves that move, and I think the move deserves love. We stand in the Andes among giant, fitted stones, then suddenly cross deserts and sea to a fertile valley in the ancient Near East. And what do we find? not a completely different problem. The same problem enlarged. 3 massive stones in the trilithon, each astonishing in scale, sitting with a kind of calm arrogance beneath later Roman grandeur. Rome built magnificently. No one needs to deny that. The columns, the courtyards, the logic of the upper complex all speak Roman very clearly. But the source insists, with good reason, that the foundation speaks another language. This is one of the most important emotional pivots in the whole transcript. Later, empire above. Older mass below. Reuse rather than origin. It is the same structure as Peru, only in a new accent. The lower the story goes, the older and stranger the mastery seems. The nearby quarry deepens that feeling. There lie giant monoliths left half-cut from bedrock, including blocks so large that they strain even modern imagination. Why begin quarrying stones heavier than any known historical lifting system could reliably place, unless the tradition that conceived them had other assumptions about what was possible? The source does not force a single answer, but it keeps the question alive in a very skillful way. An unfinished giant is often more disturbing than a finished one. A finished stone at least suggests a completed intention. An unfinished one suggests a world of intention broader than the one history allowed to survive. You know that feeling when you realize a ruin is not only a remainder, but evidence of a larger ambition you can barely glimpse. That is Baalbek. The AI angle becomes particularly vivid here because structural engineers can now model not only the weight of the trilithon stones, but the forces required to extract, transport, raise, and align them. The source describes these simulations as almost mocking the textbook explanations. Thousands of laborers with ropes and rollers, lubricated pathways, clever leverage. All of that sounds respectable until the numbers become concrete. Then the explanations begin to feel like polite desperation. Not because ancient people were weak. They were not. But because raw manpower is often used as a verbal blanket over hard technical gaps. The source is smart enough not to sneer at archaeology completely. That would make the story cruder than it needs to be. Instead, it does something better. It lets the ordinary explanations sit beside the mass of the stones until the weight itself starts bending the confidence of those explanations. 3 stones of around 900 tons each. Then larger unfinished blocks nearby. Then silence in the written record. Then a later culture using the site, but leaving no satisfying account of the deeper foundation. One begins to understand why local legends would reach for giants. Not because giants solve the problem rationally, because when engineering memory fails, scale itself begins feeling mythic. That is such an important point in stories like this. Giants are what people imagine when the built world seems larger than any remembered method. They are memory's way of admitting that something disproportionate stands before it. By now, the script has given us Saxe Huaman, Olantaitambo, and Baalbek as 3 strong notes of the same melody. Lower layers more advanced than upper ones. Precision exceeding expectation. Mass beyond ordinary comfort. Missing records. Later, Röse. Unfinished works. Mythic teachers or giant builders entering the vacuum where technical continuity should be. And that is before the machine-like stones of Pumapunku even arrive. I think it is worth pausing for a moment before going there, because the shape of the mystery is now clear enough to feel in the body. We are no longer dealing with one ancient puzzle. We are dealing with a style of impossibility, a repeated architectural personality, something that prefers gigantic scale, exact fitting, seismic intelligence, bold transport, and then vanishes, leaving later peoples to inherit, reveri, or imperfectly continue the results. That is why the source keeps whispering about a forgotten global civilization, not because the phrase sounds exciting, because by the time these sites are placed beside one another, the alternative, a dozen separate miracles without shared memory, begins to feel even stranger. From here, the path has to keep widening into Bolivia, where the blocks begin to resemble industrial components, into Easter Island, where Andean echoes appear on a lonely Pacific shore, into the broader pattern of repeated signatures that the AI systems flagged, the knobs, the fits, the unfinished monoliths, the silence, the old foundations beneath later glory. And under all of it, slowly growing louder, the possibility that the stones endured because everything else did not. The mystery changes shape when we climb higher. In Peru and Lebanon, the stones still belong, at least emotionally, to the world of walls, terraces, temples, and mountain strongholds. They are shocking, yes, but they still let the mind pretend it is dealing with architecture in a familiar sense. Then the source carries us to the high Bolivian plain, and the mood becomes stranger. Calder too. The air thins. The horizon opens. The ground looks less like a place where cities should rise, and more like a place where wind should rule everything. And there, scattered under that immense sky, lie the broken forms of Pumapunku. I have always thought Pumapunku feels less like a ruin than a machine after an explosion. Not a machine in the modern metal sense. Of course, stone is still everywhere. Andesite, red sandstone, blocks fallen and tipped and half buried in earth that seems determined to forget them. Yet the geometry is different from the earlier sites. The stones do not only feel massive, they feel standardized, repeated, measured according to an internal logic that does not look improvised. The source lingers over the H-shaped blocks for good reason. They are so famous now that it is easy to let familiarity soften their impact. But when you really sit with them, the effect is still unsettling. Hard stone, cut into repeating forms with channels, slots, right angles, clean edges, and a kind of machine-like calm. That phrase matters. Machine-like. Because ancient stonework is supposed to look laborious. It is supposed to show its effort, its blows, its roughness, its negotiation with material. At Pumapunku, according to the source, some of the blocks seem to show something else. Not just patience, process, a system capable of repeatability, a tolerance for accuracy so narrow that later explanations involving simple pounding stones and soft copper tools begin to look a little embarrassed standing next to the evidence. Recently, researchers fed extremely detailed three-dimensional scans of the Pumapunku blocks into advanced AI comparison models, and what emerged was deeply unnerving. The blocks were not merely symmetrical in a broad, decorative sense. They carried recurring ratios, repeated depths, repeating alignment logic, and stress-balanced forms that the system grouped more closely with modular production than with one-off ceremonial carving. That does not mean a factory sat on the Bolivian plain in the modern sense. It does mean that the stones behave as if they were conceived inside a disciplined technical grammar, one where parts were expected to relate to other parts before assembly even began. If you were standing beside one of those blocks in the hard, high-altitude sunlight, fingertips moving over the surface, you would notice something else too. Andesite is not forgiving. It is dense, dark, stubborn material. And yet the channels look crisp. Some holes appear drilled with a regularity that continues to trouble engineers. The source is very careful to let that trouble breathe. It does not merely shout impossible and move on. It slows down and asks, what kind of knowledge? What kind of tool behavior? What kind of patience or lost method would be required to make hard stones submit so neatly? You know that feeling when an object seems to remember a procedure even after the procedure itself has vanished. That is Pumapunku. The site also carries another sadness that the source handles beautifully. It is broken, not weathered only, not softened by time into a pleasing ruin, but shattered. Blocks lie scattered as if some force greater than abandonment passed through. There is a violence in the layout, or at least the memory of violence. The machine, if we keep that image, Pie-line is no longer assembled. Its components lie strewn under sky and wind, waiting for later people to call them ceremonial, or symbolic, or mysterious, because no easier word feels responsible enough. Some scholars, quite reasonably, place Pumapunku within the Tiwanaku world, and there is no need to deny the greatness of that civilization. But the source keeps pressing the contrast. Certain parts of Tiwanaku architecture look more conventional, more visibly compatible with known methods and gradual development. Pumapunku, especially in the precise andesite pieces, feels like the edge of another craft, perhaps inherited, perhaps preserved imperfectly, perhaps built atop older knowledge already fraying by the time later cultures handled it. I find that possibility deeply melancholy. A civilization inheriting advanced methods it can still use, but no longer fully explain. It reminds me of someone reciting a prayer in a language they do not speak, yet somehow knowing the prayer still matters. That same feeling returns when the source moves westward across the Pacific to Vinapu on Easter Island. This is one of the moments where the script becomes most quietly dangerous, because distance is supposed to protect the official story. Distance lets each anomaly live in its own little box. Peru can be Peru. Polynesia can be Polynesia. Their mysteries can remain separate and therefore manageable. But Vinapu interferes with that comfort. The basalt walls there do not look exactly identical to Andean masonry. Of course, but the resemblance is strong enough to disturb. Long, fitted faces, tight joinery, smoothed surfaces, a style that feels oddly at home beside Sacsayhuaman and other Andean examples, even though an ocean lies between them. The source is excellent here because it does not reduce the mystery to one lazy explanation. It does not simply say, "Therefore, one empire ruled the sea." Instead, it lingers in the tension. How did such a similar stone language appear in such distant places, especially when the cultures later occupying those places are usually narrated as separate worlds? This is where the AI comparison becomes almost poetic. Once researchers translated wall faces into comparable digital signatures, measuring edge logic, block profile tendencies, seam behavior, and surface finishing patterns. The models reportedly began clustering Vinapu more closely with certain Andean masonry styles than with many nearer Pacific comparenda. Again, not proof in the courtroom sense, but resemblance with statistical pressure behind it, enough to turn curiosity into insomnia. And then the source brings in the old clues that the ocean may never have been the barrier our school maps encouraged us to imagine. Sweet potatoes crossing between South America and Polynesia, genetic traces, oral traditions of voyaging, contacts debated for years, sometimes politely, sometimes bitterly. The source uses these not as complete answers, but as openings. If people crossed, ideas crossed. If ideas crossed, techniques crossed. And if techniques crossed, then the Pacific stops feeling empty and starts feeling like a corridor of lost memory. I have always liked that reversal. Ocean as bridge rather than wall. It changes the emotional map of the ancient world immediately. Picture a basalt wall on a remote island in the wind. Salt in the air. Surf speaking below cliffs. The fitted stones still hold their line. Nothing about that place should feel Andean. And yet in the wall some faint family resemblance stirs. The source wants the listener to feel that stir and not look away too quickly. Because once one echo is allowed, others begin arriving. By now, the story is no longer really about individual sites. It is about the grammar they share. Giant scale in some places. Machine-like precision in others. Lower layers superior to upper ones. Repeating knobs. Repeating tight seams. Repeating silences in the record. A sense everywhere that later peoples inherited something they revered, reused, or could only partially imitate. And this is where the source begins lifting the mystery out of regional history and into civilizational pattern. It asks whether the same unknown builder tradition, or the same lost science, might have scattered itself around the globe before history narrowed. Not as a fantasy empire necessarily marching under one flag, but as a technical inheritance, a worldview, a network, perhaps even the broken remains of one much older world shattered by catastrophe and remembered only in stones. Myths and stubborn details the official timeline cannot quite digest. The emotional effect of that idea is enormous. It means the stones are not isolated marvels. They are fragments of conversation, one wall answering another across mountains and oceans. One abandoned quarry speaking to another unfinished block half a world away. One builder signature surfacing wherever history later settled on top of older foundations. By the time the source finishes this movement, the listener is no longer standing only in Bolivia or on Easter Island. The listener is standing inside a widening field of recurrence. The world begins to feel smaller in a very old way. Smaller because the same impossible habits keep reappearing. Smaller because a forgotten tradition, if it existed, may have once linked places our modern categories insist on separating. And once that field is visible, more distant and stranger echoes become impossible to ignore. A wall in Montana. Giant foundation blocks beneath the more famous stones of Egypt. Titanic-seeming masonry in Siberia. Magnetic oddities. Mountain fractures. Legends of fire. Vater. And vanished teachers drifting around all of them like smoke. That is where the next part has to go, into the wider chorus, where the source stops asking whether one site is mysterious and starts asking why the whole planet seems to remember the same lost hand in so many different accents. Once the pattern leaves the famous sites and begins appearing in unexpected places, the story becomes much harder to tuck away. That is the mood of the next movement. Up to now. A skeptic can still comfort himself with the idea that Peru is full of wonders, that Bolivia is full of unresolved archaeology, that Lebanon has always mixed layers of empire, and that remote island walls may look more similar than they really are. But then the source widens again. It goes to places that do not belong to the usual television montage of ancient mysteries. And there the same emotional signatures begin appearing. Strange fit. Strange mass. Strange silence. It is like hearing the same note played on instruments made of different landscapes. The first of these, in the source, is Sage Wall in Montana. I think it is a brilliant inclusion because it arrives like a whisper rather than a proclamation. The Grand Temple Complex. No famous global pilgrimage destination. Just a wall-like formation of huge fitted stone blocks in the mountains of the American West, hidden under pine, shadow, and weather, as though the land itself is reluctant to show it clearly. The source describes polygonal fitting there. Massive blocks aligned with the same sort of unsettling composure we have already seen elsewhere. Not identical. No. Yet familiar enough that once the listener has been trained by the earlier sites, recognition begins almost immediately. That is one of the great powers of pattern. It teaches the eye what to fear. Researchers have reportedly used terrain mapping, stone face analysis, and magnetic surveys there as well. And the source lingers over the magnetic anomalies. Compasses drifting. Sensors behaving oddly. No, magnetic irregularities are not rare in geology. They can emerge from perfectly natural causes. We should say that clearly. But the source uses them in a subtler way. Not as a magic trick, but as one more repeating disturbance around places already burdened with improbable architecture. One anomaly is geology. 5 anomalies across a family of already difficult sites begins to feel like atmosphere. If you were standing there at dusk, in cold mountain air, with the smell of pine and old stone rising around you, you might not first think civilization. You might think wound. The wall seems to have emerged from the mountain, the way bone can emerge through skin in an old injury. That image feels right to me. These megalithic appearances often look less like construction from scratch and more like exposure, as though time has worn the mountain back until the old structure inside begins showing itself. And then the source swings south and east again, all the way to Egypt. This is another dangerous move, narratively speaking. Because Egypt is already so full of accepted wonder that it is easy for new mystery to drown inside old familiarity. Everyone knows the pyramids. Everyone knows the great stones. But the source is not primarily interested in the famous surfaces. It is interested in what lies underneath and around them. Foundation blocks, lower courses, the rough fact that some of the deepest masonry at Giza and related sites appears to belong to a tradition of gigantic stone handling that later dynastic work, while still astonishing, sometimes seems to stand upon rather than fully begin. I have always found that distinction very important. It is possible for a civilization to inherit magnificence and still be magnificent itself. These things are not mutually exclusive. The source is not trying to humiliate Egypt or Rome or the Inca. It is trying to deepen the timeline beneath them. And in Egypt, that depth feels especially haunting because the plateau already carries such an enormous burden of meaning. To suggest that some parts of its megalithic intelligence may be older still is to pull the floor out from under one of history's most famous certainties. The AI work described by the source becomes especially powerful here. Geological scans of the Giza Plateau, tool mark comparisons, weathering analyses, and foundation block metrics have reportedly been fed into models trained to distinguish quarry signatures, transport assumptions, and construction phase. The result, according to the story, is not a clean answer, but a troubling one. Certain lower megalithic components behave more like members of the global anomaly family than like ordinary extensions of the later dynastic narrative. That does not mean someone with lasers built Egypt in the childish sense people fear whenever these conversations begin. It means the deeper stone language may be older, broader, and more continuous than our labels have admitted. And if you allow that, even once, then a door opens. Because once Egypt joins Peru, Bolivia, Lebanon, the Pacific, and Montana in a common register of unease, the idea of isolated genius starts to wobble very badly. Then comes Siberia, and with it, one of the most physically overwhelming images in the whole source. Gornaya Shoria. I think Siberia works so well in the script because it feels almost too remote to have joined the same conversation. Harsh mountains, cold forests, a landscape that seems built for endurance rather than ceremony. And there, according to the source, giant block-like formations appear at a scale that strains ordinary language. Some estimates suggest individual masses so extreme that even 900-ton stones begin feeling almost manageable by comparison. Now, estimates at such sites are notoriously unstable, and geology can play cruel tricks on perception. It is important not to race ahead of the evidence. Yet the emotional shock remains, because even if the most extreme numbers soften under closer analysis, the forms themselves still provoke. Massive seeming blocks, clean edges, coarse disturbance, a sense of a structure that has suffered violence or impossible age. The source treats Gornaya Shoria almost like the limit case, the place where the global pattern tips from intriguing into nearly surreal. If Siberia carries the same signature, then where does the pattern stop? You know that feeling when a map begins lighting up in too many places at once? That is this section. And now, with the world so widely threaded by giant, precise stone, the source makes its next great move. It asks what kind of event would leave exactly this sort of residue. Not surviving books, not surviving cities in their full administrative life, not surviving dynasties with clean continuity. Stone, foundation, fragments, lower works, abandoned monoliths, interrupted transport, legends of former ages, floods, fire, drowned lands, teachers who arrive after catastrophe, bearing knowledge from somewhere before memory. This is where myth enters the room not as decoration, but as testimony under distortion. The source gathers flood stories from Mesopotamia, from the biblical tradition, from India, from the Andes, from Polynesia, from the Americas. It notes how often the same emotional structure appears. A great destruction, water or fire from the sky, a reset, survivors, then culture bringers, lawgivers, star readers, civilizers. The source is careful enough to let this remain a possibility rather than a settled verdict. Yet the pattern is powerful. What if these myths are not simply poetic expressions of human fear, but broken memories of a real planetary rupture, one severe enough to destroy most forms of continuity while leaving only the heaviest stone and the most compressible stories behind? I have always found that idea deeply moving. Not because it is cheerful. Clearly, it is not. But because it explains why stone and myth cling together so often. When records drown, stories float. The end of the Ice Age hovers over this whole part of the script like a dim old ghost. Rising seas, meltwater pulses, shorelines lost, climatic instability, whole coastal worlds erased. The source treats that not as proof of one exact forgotten empire, but as a plausible stage on which such forgetting could have happened. If an earlier megalithic tradition flourished in regions later drowned or shattered, then its surviving mountain sites, inland foundations, and high stone works would appear to us exactly as they do now. Isolated, ancient, superior in their oldest layers, bereft of manuals, wrapped in flood legends. That is an elegant hypothesis. Perhaps too elegant in places, but elegant nonetheless. And then the source risks the oldest lost civilization idea of all, Mu. Now, Mu is a dangerous word in academic rooms. It carries too much speculative baggage, too many overconfident maps of drowned continents and vanished empires drawn with more enthusiasm than evidence. The source knows this. It does not quite present Mu as settled geography. It presents it more as a model of lost coherence, a name for the intuition that these scattered megalithic signatures may once have belonged to a connected world far older than accepted civilization. Whether the name is correct matters less, perhaps, than the pressure behind it. The pressure says the world was once more linked, more advanced in selected technical ways, then broken. And if that were true, the stones become messages. Not messages carved in alphabetic sentences. Message in endurance, in fit, in impossible mass. In the fact that they remain while everything lighter has vanished, The source grows almost tender here, and I think tenderness is appropriate. These walls and monoliths have survived flood, quake, empire, neglect, looting, weather, and academic embarrassment. They are still present, still speaking in the only language catastrophe could not completely erase. The AI systems, in the source's telling, help because they are very good at hearing that language without caring about our inherited categories. They compare surfaces, geometries, frequencies, tool signature possibilities, quarry patterns, and weathering asymmetries. They do not know which sites are respectable and which are fringe. They only know recurrence. And recurrence is what keeps coming back. Across climates, across continents, across the official walls we built between separate ancient worlds. Honestly, that is the point in the story where I stop thinking first about lost civilizations and start thinking about lost confidence. Our confidence? I mean, the confidence that history rises smoothly. The confidence that the earliest known builders were the simplest. The confidence that absence of explanation equals absence of problem. The stones unsettle all of that. By the end of this movement, the world feels older, smaller, and sadder. Older because the technical capacity implied by some of these sites may belong to a time deeper than accepted chronologies like to admit. Smaller because Peru speaks to Lebanon, which speaks to Bolivia, which speaks to the Pacific, which speaks to Egypt and Siberia and strange American mountains, all in the same low architectural tone. Sadder because if there was a coherent world behind all this, it is gone. What remains are fragments, and fragments are beautiful in a lonely way. That loneliness matters. It is what turns wonder into sleep-worthy mystery. We are not only looking at marvels, we are looking at survivors of forgetting. And that means the final part of this story cannot really be about proof in the dry sense. It has to be about what the stones ask of us now. Whether they imply a forgotten global civilization, a lost science of shaping and moving matter, a cyclic history in which progress can fall backward, or simply a humbling admission that the ancient world knew things we no longer know how to recover. The source wants to end there, in that soft and difficult space, where the stones across the continents stop being ruins and begin feeling like the last unread textbook of a drowned age. By the time the pattern of these stones has spread across mountains, deserts, eastlands, and forgotten ridges, the mind begins asking a darker question. Not who built one wall, but what kind of event could leave behind exactly this sort of evidence? Giant foundations, lower layers of impossible precision, abandoned monoliths, shattered high stone platforms, echoes of the same strange masonry language on opposite sides of the earth. The source moves into that question carefully, and I think that care matters, because once catastrophe enters the story, it changes the air around every block. A wall can be a triumph when history is intact. A wall becomes a survivor when history is broken. That is the feeling I cannot shake when I think about these megalithic sites at night. Sacsayhuaman, still standing above Cusco with the quiet certainty of something that has already outlived many explanations. Ollantaytambo, with its great monoliths and its interrupted transport lines. as if the mountain itself remembers the sudden stopping of a very large plan. Baalbek, where the trilithon beneath the later temple feels less like a foundation and more like the exposed bone of an older world. Pumapunku, scattered across the high plain like a shattered geometry that someone once understood perfectly. Vinapu, speaking in a strangely Andean accent on a Pacific island where that voice should feel impossible. Then Sage Wall, Giza, Gornaya Shoria, each one adding another low note to the same grave song. The source argues that such a pattern begins making more sense if we stop imagining these stones as the beginning of civilization and begin imagining them as what remained after something older failed. I have always thought that is the most unsettling possibility. Not that there was some magical age of giants, but that there may have been an age of skill, engineering, and global contact that was damaged so thoroughly that later people inherited only the hardest fragments. If that happened, then the megaliths become exactly what we would expect to survive. Stone, weight, fit, endurance. Everything else would be softer. Everything else would be easier for time, water, fire, and upheaval to erase. This is where the source turns toward flood memory. And honestly, once it does, the whole world starts sounding different. Flood stories are so common that people often stop hearing how strange that is. We are told that floods are universal because rivers flood, because farming civilizations settle near water, because human beings everywhere fear drowning. All of that is reasonable. Yet the source asks for a slower hearing. Mesopotamia remembers waters that erase a world. The Hebrew tradition remembers a flood that resets history. India remembers destruction by water and the preservation of life through warning. The Andes remember earlier worlds destroyed before the present age. Polynesian traditions carry memories of land loss and ocean upheaval. The Americas hold many stories of inundation, darkness, and a few survivors carrying memory forward. Again and again, the same emotional architecture appears. A great destruction, a small survival, then culture returning after ruin. That last part matters most to me. Culture returning. Because if all these were only stories about weather, one would expect the ending to be simpler. People survive. Life continues. Instead, in so many traditions, there is a second movement. Teachers appear. Law comes back. Building comes back. Agriculture comes back. Knowledge is restored, as if catastrophe did not merely threaten lives, but interrupted a system that had to be reintroduced. You know that feeling when a story keeps circling the same shape, even when it wears different names. That is what happens here. Water takes the world. A remnant survives. Then knowledge re-enters through chosen carriers. The source suggests that this recurring shape may be the mythic memory of a real rupture near the end of the Ice Age, when sea levels rose, coastlines drowned, and climatic shocks rewrote entire regions. This is where modern AI enters the narrative in a fascinating way. Researchers have begun feeding paleoclimate data, shoreline reconstructions, flood layers, glacial melt models, and cross-cultural myth databases into machine learning systems. not to prove one fantasy civilization in one clean gesture, but to ask a quieter question. Do the most persistent ancient destruction stories cluster around real periods of severe planetary instability? The answer, in the source, is deeply suggestive. The models repeatedly align many flood and reset traditions with ancient windows of abrupt environmental upheaval. Sudden sea rise, meltwater pulses, regional megafloods, coastlines erased over generations. The result is not a fairy tale and not a solved case. It is something more unnerving. A plausible world in which a sophisticated coastal or maritime civilization could be broken so thoroughly that only upland stone and broken memory remained. And once that possibility opens, the megaliths stop being merely hard to explain. They become exactly the sort of evidence catastrophe would leave behind. Imagine a low coastal center before the waters came. Not Atlantis with shining crystals, not a cartoon of lost grandeur, just a real human settlement of extraordinary skill. Harbors, perhaps, platforms, stone quays, astronomical markers, workshops where stone was cut with methods no longer common, archives and materials less durable than the platforms beneath them. Skilled labor passed through training, not mystery. Then sea levels rise, or storms intensify, or land sinks, or all of it happens in cycles that become unbearable. The coast retreats, the harbor fails, the lower city drowns. People move inland with what they can carry, tools perhaps, more likely memories, radios, methods, stories of what the old world knew. I think that is one reason flood memory stays so heavy in the human mind. Water does not only kill, it edits. The source keeps returning to this idea without becoming shrill about it. A flood is not only destruction, it is selection. It selects what survives materially. It selects what can be retold. It selects which traditions are reduced to symbol. It selects which techniques remain embodied for one more generation, and which vanish because the people who carried them vanish. And among all these selections, giant stone has one great advantage. It is very hard to erase. That is why the lower layers at so many sites feel so important. If later cultures rebuilt after catastrophe, then the surviving megalithic bases would naturally look older, weaser, and harder to reproduce. This is exactly what the source keeps emphasizing. The Inca may have inherited older foundations. Roman builders may have used older substructures at Baalbek. Later ritual cultures may have settled around earlier stone platforms whose original builders were already wrapped in legend. The same emotional pattern keeps repeating. Later civilization stands above earlier mastery like a student living in a dead master's house. And then there are the unfinished stones, which may be the saddest evidence of all. I cannot stop thinking about abandoned monoliths. The great half-freed blocks near Baalbek. The transport stones left on mountain routes near Ollantay Tambo. The scattered components at Pumapunku that look less like decay and more like interruption. Finished monuments tell us something immense was achieved. Unfinished ones tell us something immense was expected to continue, and then did not. They carry the mood of a hand set down and never lifted again. The source understands this perfectly. An unfinished megalith is not just a technical curiosity. It is a frozen future. Someone planned more. Someone believed the system would remain in place long enough to complete the task. Then something happened that made continuation impossible, or irrelevant, or unremembered. Honestly, I find that more moving than the finished walls. A completed monument can feel proud. An unfinished one feels human. This is where the old culture bringer myths begin sounding less like fantasy and more like refracted history. Viracocha in the Andes. Oannes in Mesopotamia. Teachers arriving after destruction. Skilled beings emerging from sea or distance to restore order. Law, agriculture, measurement, and building. The source does not insist that these were literal survivors in every case, but it presses a powerful intuition. If an earlier world broke, then later peoples might remember its last knowledgeable carriers not as engineers or refugees, but as divine teachers. A person who knows how to raise impossible stone after a catastrophe would indeed feel godlike to those starting over. That possibility softens the line between myth and memory in a way I find deeply convincing. Not because every legend becomes a documentary. It does not. But because legends often keep emotional truth intact even after names, place, and mechanisms have drifted. The source also widens the catastrophe beyond water alone. There are traditions of fire from the sky, of darkness, of falling stars, of the heavens becoming hostile. This, too, fits the general pattern of a remembered reset. Not a single neat event, maybe, but a violent, ancient period in which multiple stresses, sea rise, floods, quakes, impacts, atmospheric disturbance, shattered continuity across the world that had once supported a higher level of technical or organizational sophistication. Once again, the AI comparison is useful here. By cross-referencing destruction myths, cosmic imagery, sediment data, and known climatic disruptions, researchers are at least able to ask whether the old stories preserve layered memories of different but related catastrophes. The source suggests the answer may be yes. And when that answer settles in, even a little, the stones change again. They no longer look only like achievements. They look like lifeboats. That word may sound too dramatic, but I think it fits. These structures carry forward something that lighter civilizations could not. Not whole libraries, perhaps not whole political systems, but competence. They say that someone could think at this scale, move matter at this scale, plan at this scale, fit stone this tightly, build for earthquakes, for time, for weight, for some future beyond immediate use. If history were a straight road, these megaliths would feel like the first milestones. In the source's telling, they feel more like old seawalls from a drowned coast. That image calms me in a strange way, because it means the puzzle is not that ancient people were secretly superhuman. The puzzle is that human capability may be far more vulnerable to interruption than our modern pride likes to admit. By the time this part closes, the atmosphere has become very still. The world of the megaliths is no longer simply mysterious. It is post-catastrophe. The giant stones endure because other kinds of evidence do not. The myths endure because story floats when archives drown. The lower layers keep looking better because they are the bones of an older order. The unfinished blocks keep waiting because the hands that knew the next step never came back. And from here, the story naturally turns from catastrophe toward hidden method. If a world of skill was broken, what exactly was lost? What science of stone, force, transport, cutting, shaping, or softening disappeared with it? What survived only as symbols, legends, and strange repeated details like knobs, seams, and machine quiet geometry. That is where the next part moves, into the darker and more speculative heart of the mystery. Not just a lost civilization, but a lost science concealed inside the stones themselves. If catastrophe explains why the builders disappeared, the next question becomes even more intimate. What exactly vanished with them? That is where the source grows quieter, stranger, and in some ways, more compelling than ever. We have already followed the stones across the world. We have watched them gather into a pattern. We have let flood and fire and rupture settle over them like a second weather. Now the mystery turns inward. Not only who built them, but how. Not just what was lost, but what kind of knowledge was lost so completely that later ages could admire the results and still fail to repeat them. I think this is the part that keeps people awake. Lost civilizations are dramatic enough, but lost method is more haunting. Method is intimate. It lives in the hand, the body, the apprenticeship, the sequence of operations too ordinary to record when everyone still knows them. A civilization can lose myths and keep methods. It can also lose methods and keep only myths. The source suggests the megalithic world may have suffered the second kind of death. Take the walls of Sacsayhuaman again. Take the calm precision of those giant polygonal stones, the way each one touches several others in an arrangement that seems improvised, only until you realize how much planning, improvisation of that quality would require. Take the front wall of Ollantaytambo, where those immense pink stones stand with a confidence their rougher neighbors do not share. Take the H-blocks of Puma Punku, so crisp, so repeatable, so indifferent to the hardness of andesite. Take the trilithon at Baalbek, a weight so absurd that explanation begins to sweat around it. The source keeps returning to the same whisper. These are not only monuments, they are technical documents in stone. You know that feeling when a finished object contains instructions you can no longer read? That is every one of these sites. Modern AI has been especially useful here, at least in the source, because it can model process rather than merely stare at outcome. Researchers have begun feeding high-resolution surface scans, quarry data, micro-abrasion patterns, structural tolerances, and tool mark comparisons into systems designed to simulate plausible production sequences. Instead of asking only what the stones look like, they ask what chain of actions would most efficiently produce what we see. Cutting, shaping, moving, fitting, finishing. What emerges in the source is not a tidy miracle and not a childish claim that the ancients had gadgets identical to ours. It is something more interesting. Hybrid technique. That phrase matters. Hybrid technique. The models reportedly struggle when forced into one simplistic explanation. Hard hammering alone does not satisfy the surfaces. Copper tools alone do not satisfy the precision in the hardest stone. Endless labor alone does not satisfy the repeated modularity. But when mixed method scenarios are introduced, abrasion, selective heating, softening agents, pressure fitting, repeated surface checking, careful templating, resonance-assisted movement, perhaps some geopolymer or stone reconstitution in very limited cases, the simulations begin behaving more plausibly. Not proven, but more plausible. Honestly, I think that is exactly what a lost science would look like from far away. Not one magical trick, a system of ordinary, extraordinary things combined so intelligently that later ages, missing even one or two links, would no longer be able to recreate the whole. The source spends time on stone softening legends, and I understand why. In the Andes, there are old stories about plants whose juices could weaken rock. In Egypt, there are theories about geopolymer casting and artificial stone for some elements, though these remain heavily debated. Elsewhere, people speak of sound, resonance, vibration, or techniques that made huge mass behave less stubbornly than raw strength alone would allow. Some of these ideas may be wrong. Some may be exaggerations wrapped around more practical methods. Yet the fact that so many traditions remember stone not simply as cut, but as somehow persuaded, remains intriguing. I have always loved that word, persuaded. It feels more accurate to the surfaces than hacked. If you place your hand mentally on one of those ancient blocks and let the imagination slow down, you can almost feel the missing method as a kind of cool absence. Not a supernatural aura. Something subtler. The sense that the stone knows the sequence that shaped it, even if we do not. Its face, its curve, its drilled corner, its impossible seam. All of them are answers to questions the modern world has not fully reconstructed. This is where the source introduces a bigger philosophical pressure. What if history is not a ladder, but a cycle? What if there have been peaks before? Not identical to ours, not full of satellites and microchips, but peaks of skill, organization, and earth knowledge that later worlds forgot. In that model, the megaliths stop being anomalies and become perfectly logical. They are not the crude first steps of culture. They are the remaining hard parts of a previous high point. That idea sounds grand, but the emotional effect is very soft. It means decline is real. It means knowledge can fall backwards. It means later is not always better. I think many people feel that possibility instinctively when they stand before ancient stone. The source simply gives that feeling a clearer voice. And once cyclical history enters the room, every repeating signature in the megaliths grows more meaningful. The knobs, the finely balanced lower layers, the long transport lines, the huge abandoned stones, the precision in places where rougher methods would have worked well enough. These begin to look less like isolated eccentricities and more like habits from a mature technical culture. A culture that did not only know how to move stone, but knew why it preferred certain forms, certain join, certaines proportions, certain kinds of permanence. That permanence may have been intentional in a deeper sense, too. The source suggests the stones may function not only as structures, but as memory storage. Not written memory. Durable memory. A way to carry civilizational knowledge through collapse by embodying it in the most difficult-to-destroy form available. This is one of the most elegant ideas in the entire script, and I think it deserves to be felt slowly. A scroll says something explicitly, but it can burn. An inscription names a king, but it can be broken. A temple ritual can preserve a method symbolically, but the symbol can drift. A giant, fitted platform, however, continues teaching with no translation required. It teaches that this level of skill existed. It teaches that someone solved load, fit, alignment, and endurance at extraordinary scale. It teaches that precision belonged to deep antiquity. It teaches through stubborn existence. That may be why the source calls the megaliths messages. Not messages in grammar, but in endurance. They speak by remaining. I find that deeply comforting in a dark way, because if an earlier civilization knew it was vulnerable, if it sensed flood, quake, sea rise, or political rupture, then building in stone may have been less vanity than insurance. Leave something the next age cannot wholly erase. Leave a foundation so large and well-fitted that later people must build around it. Leave a puzzle that keeps asking questions long after names are gone. You know that feeling when someone leaves behind a tool so well made that even after the instructions are lost, you still understand that they were serious. That is how these stones feel. The source then returns, beautifully, to the modern moment. The AI systems comparing all of this do not solve the mystery. That is not their role here. What they do is remove some of the old fog. They compare shapes without academic embarrassment. They compare sites across continents without being told that one belongs in a respectable box and another in a fringe box. They analyze similarity, recurrence, procedural plausibility, and anomaly clusters. In doing so, they begin reviving a conversation that was easier to ignore when every site stood alone under its own national story. I think that is one of the loveliest ironies in the entire tale. Modern machine intelligence, born from our own age of systems and comparison, may be helping us hear the voice of a much older system that once vanished almost completely. Not because the machine knows the answer, because it can hear repetition where we learned to hear separate cases. And once repetition is audible, the world becomes stranger and calmer at the same time. Stranger because the implications grow larger. Calmer because the stones no longer seem random. They belong to one weather of history, one deep pressure, one missing chapter or family of chapters. Even if we never recover the full method, we can feel its outline now. An outline in mass, proportion, siam, and silence. So the source leaves us here for a while, in that outline. Perhaps there was a forgotten global civilization. Perhaps several linked civilizations shared a technical inheritance, later broken by catastrophe. Perhaps what people once called Mu was not a single drowned continent, but a blurred memory of coherence lost to rising seas and fractured time. Perhaps later peoples, brilliant in their own right, stood among older stones and mistook inheritance for origin the way we often have since. Perhaps the megaliths were built partly as warnings, partly as memory vaults, partly simply because their makers thought in scales we no longer inhabit. Whatever version is closest to truth, the stones have already done their work on us. They have made the simple story difficult again. And that, I think, is the right place to rest before the final movement. The stones remain. The lost methods remain hidden inside them. The flood memory still moves beneath the myths. The AI comparisons keep widening the pattern. History begins to look less like a smooth first dawn and more like late light on the ruins of an earlier afternoon. We are not at the beginning, after all. We may be standing in the long echo of something older, listening to a science that survived only by becoming stone. By the time all these sites are laid beside one another, the mystery has become less about one lost culture and more about the behavior of memory itself. That is where the story turns now. Not back toward smaller explanations, but toward the long afterlife of the stones. Because even if an earlier world was broken by flood, fire, sea rise, or some chain of ancient catastrophe, something in it refused to disappear completely. It remained in walls. It remained in platforms. It remained in the old habit of fitting stone so tightly that later ages could only stand in front of it and grow quiet. Recently, researchers began using advanced AI systems to compare not only the visible geometry of these megalithic sites, but the larger pattern of what survived around them. They fed the models maps of known flood zones, paleoclimate reconstructions, oral tradition, later settlement layers, quarry signatures, and even the statistical frequency of certain recurring details. Knobs, scoop marks, lower course superiority, unfinished blocks, magnetic disturbances, and inherited building phases. What began to appear was not one simple answer. It was something more haunting, a survival pattern. The oldest and most refined work often remained where catastrophe was least able to erase it, in uplands, in massive foundations, in mountain fortresses, in giant blocks too heavy to move again, and in fragments so durable that later cultures had no choice but to work around them. I have always found that deeply moving, because it means the megaliths may not be the brightest expression of a lost world. They may be the last one. That changes how the sites feel. Sacsayhuaman is no longer only a fortress. It becomes a high surviving edge of a knowledge system that may once have reached much farther. Ollantaytambo is no longer only a sacred complex. It becomes a place where interrupted transfer is still visible, where older mastery and later reverence coexist in the same stone face. Baalbek becomes something even more solemn, a reused remnant of impossible ambition. Puma Punku becomes a field of broken syntax from an ancient technical language. Vinapu becomes a coastal echo, a reminder that oceans may have joined worlds long before modern certainty felt comfortable saying so. The source keeps returning to one central wound. The record is missing where it should be richest. That is not a minor inconvenience. It is the whole mood of the story. If a very old megalithic civilization, or network of civilizations, once existed, then the cruelest part of its destruction would not only be the death of people or the drowning of cities. It would be the severing of continuity. Apprentices would lose masters. Techniques would lose context. Precision would survive in results, but not in method. Later generations would inherit marvels with no living chain of instruction long enough to explain them. You know that feeling when an old object is obviously important, but the one sentence that would tell you why has vanished. That is what these stones do to the mind. The source argues that this is exactly why myths about civilizing teachers appear after catastrophe in so many places. A broken world creates a hunger for return. In the Andes, the teacher comes. In Mesopotamia, the wise one emerges from the waters. In other regions, gods or sages arrive carrying agriculture, law, astronomy, navigation, healing, or measurement. Modern people often file these stories under religion and move on. The source slows down there and asks a harder question. What if these are not merely fantasies about divine kindness? What if they are distant cultural memories of survivors, or inheritors, or knowledge bearers carrying fragments of an earlier system into a diminished world? That possibility has a strange softness to it. It does not require giant fantasy kingdoms. It only requires collapse severe enough that knowledge begins looking divine when it returns. And that, honestly, is easy to imagine. If you had lost the method for setting immense polygonal stones, the person who still knew even part of it would seem impossible. If sea rise and social breakdown had erased the ordinary institutions that carried mathematics, calendar keeping, transport planning, and seismic design, then anyone who reintroduced those capacities would look like a messenger from another order of reality. We do not need to make the ancients foolish to understand that. We only need to remember how quickly knowledge becomes miracle once the chain of training is broken. The AI comparison work in the source goes even farther than architecture. It also compares narrative structures and myths of cultural renewal. A warning, a destruction, a remnant, then a bearer of skill, then rebuilding on top of older foundations. That sequence repeats often enough to make coincidence feel increasingly tired. Again, this does not prove one single world empire hidden behind every legend. The source is more interesting than that. It suggests a distributed memory, a planetary ache, different peoples remembering the same kind of loss in their own accents, with their own names, but preserving the same emotional grammar. I think that is why the megaliths begin to feel almost compassionate by this point in the story. They did not save everything. They could not. But they saved a pressure of truth. They saved the fact that extraordinary competence existed. They saved the evidence that history does not always move upward. They saved the suspicion that later civilizations stood not only on Earth, but on inheritance. This is where the source quietly enters one of its most beautiful ideas. The stones are not just ruins. They are continuity devices. Not books, not speeches, not royal records. Continuity devices. A fitted wall carries method in its outcome. A giant platform carries engineering judgment in its proportions. An unfinished monolith carries the scale of expectation. A lower course, more refined than the upper one, carries the memory of decline. Knobs, seams, and repeated signatures carry the fingerprints of a vanished craft tradition. Even when the explanation is gone, the evidence of explanation remains. That may be why the sights can feel so calming even while they are unsettling. They resist total oblivion. They refuse to cooperate with a simple story of cultural innocence slowly becoming sophistication. They stand there, through empire and earthquake and rain, continuing to insist that human capability is older, stranger, and perhaps more fragile than the modern timeline likes to admit. The source then looks at what later civilizations did with this inheritance, and I think this section deserves to be taken slowly. Later peoples did not simply ignore the old stones. They reused them, revered them, built above them, reframed them, wove myths around them, made them sacred. That matters because sacredness may have been one of the main ways lost knowledge stayed protected after direct understanding faded. A foundation no one could reproduce became holy. A wall no one could explain became the work of gods. A platform aligned to the sky became the center of ritual rather than engineering study. In that way, religion may have served not only to mystify old science, but to preserve it long enough that some trace survived. I have always found that idea both sad and elegant. The sacred can be a grave for knowledge, but also its shelter. Imagine standing in a later age before one of these inherited structures. You do not know exactly how it was made, but you know it exceeds ordinary skill. You know it should not be treated lightly. So you create stories. You place offerings there. You say the stones were raised by gods, or giants, or ancestors of immense power. To a modern ear, that sounds like confusion, yet it may also be respect in its most durable form. A society that no longer has the method still knows the result deserves reverence. That is why the source keeps returning to the silence of the stones. Silence is not emptiness here. It is compressed memory. And now the whole pattern reaches our own time. Modern archaeologists excavate. Engineers compare. Geologists measure. AI systems cross-reference. Geneticists look at patterns of contact and movement. Oceanographers reconstruct drowned coastlines. None of them alone solves the puzzle. Yet together they are doing something that older scholarship often resisted. They are allowing the sites to talk to one another. That is the real breakthrough in the source. Not one new object. Not one dramatic chamber opened under a pyramid. Comparison. Wide comparison. The kind of wide comparison that machines can do without embarrassment, without disciplinary boundaries, without the tired reflex that says Peru belongs over here, and Lebanon over there, and the Pacific over there. And under no circumstances should one ask whether these distant stones are members of the same family. But they may be. Not identical. Not made by one hand. Not needing one perfect Atlantis-shaped solution. A family is enough. A lost technical family. A dispersed civilization. A broken network. A world of builders who once shared more than later history allowed to remain obvious. By the close of this section, the source is no longer asking us to choose between fantasy and textbooks. It is asking us to accept a more difficult middle. Human history may include advanced chapters that ended badly. Catastrophe may have narrowed what survived. Later cultures may have inherited fragments they honored but could not fully continue. And the megaliths may be the last durable teachers from that drowned curriculum. That is why the story now has to move toward its final, quiet conclusion. Not proof in the dry legal sense. Something softer and heavier. The recognition that the stones themselves may be the last textbooks of a forgotten age, and that our task is not to force them into a neat answer, but to read the pressure they continue to place on the accepted story of civilization. In the end, the most unsettling thing about the megaliths is not their size. It is their composure. They do not look confused. They do not look accidental. They do not look like the first uncertain steps of people barely discovering how to stack heavy things. They look like the finished expressions of a confidence that had already matured. And once you feel that, once you really feel it, the whole official timeline becomes harder to carry in the old easy way. The source ends there. And I think it ends there because that is where the mystery becomes most intimate. Not in some drowned continent you cannot visit, but in the actual sensation of standing before ancient stone and realizing that it may remember a world your education never really prepared you for. Recently, researchers used advanced AI models to do something very simple and very dangerous. They stopped treating the megalithic sites as isolated wonders. They let them speak to one another across data, geometry to geometry, quarry to quarry, flood memory to flood memory, lower foundation to lower foundation, magnetic anomaly to magnetic anomaly, mythic structure to mythic structure. The systems did not return a tidy postcard from a vanished empire. What they returned was pressure. Pressure toward coherence. Pressure toward shared inheritance. Pressure toward the possibility that history is not a clean ascent from ignorance into mastery, but a cycle in which mastery can be lost and later mistaken for miracle. That idea has stayed with me more than any single block or wall. Because once a civilization is allowed to forget, everything changes. The extraordinary becomes sacred. The inherited becomes local. The remnant becomes the origin story. The lower stones become anonymous. The later builders get the names because they are the ones whose records survive. And the old work, still standing beneath them, must accept the strange fate of being admired and misunderstood at the same time. I think that is the true loneliness of these monuments. Sacsayhuaman knows more than the chronicles beneath it. Ollantaytambo remembers a project larger than its surviving story. Baalbek carries a weight that language keeps stepping around. Pumapunku still looks like the scattered parts of a discipline that no longer has practitioners. Vinapu keeps its accent across the ocean. Giza rests on deeper questions than most tourists are ever asked to hold. Sagewall waits in mountain quiet. Gornaya Shoria stares out from cold stone like a thought too large to finish. And through all of them runs the same low human question. What if we are later than we think? That question is not the same as saying every legend is literal or every speculative map is correct. The source is wiser than that in its best moments. It does not require a cartoon lost civilization with impossible machines and theatrical costumes. It requires something much more plausible and much sadder. A technically serious world. or network of worlds once existed. It was broken by catastrophe, sea rise, flood, quake, fire, fragmentation, or all of these in layered succession. Later, peoples inherited pieces. Some revered them. Some reused them. Some built above them. Some transformed their memory into gods, giant, sacred ancestors, and culture bringers. The methods faded. The stones remained. Honestly, that feels less like fantasy than a sober reading of what civilizations often do. They forget unevenly. They preserve what they cannot reproduce by making it holy. They compress lost science into symbol. They turn surviving skill into legend, because legend is easier to hold than the fact of decline. The source leaves us with one more beautiful inversion. We often think of archaeology as the recovery of the past. But here, archaeology becomes the recovery of lost confidence. Not confidence in a particular fringe theory, but confidence that the past may be much larger than its official summary. The stones do not give us comfort in the usual sense. They do not say everything is known. They say the opposite. Yet there is a peace in that too. Mystery can be honest. Mystery can remind us that the world is older than our categories. You know that feeling when a question becomes so large it stops sounding like a problem and starts sounding like weather. That is the feeling here. The flood myths remain. The climate data remains. The drowned shorelines remain beneath the sea. The unfinished monoliths remain near their quarries. The lower walls remain finer than the upper ones. The AI comparisons remain suggestive. The old signatures remain repeated. The silence remains where the manual should be. None of this forces one single final sentence, but all of it bends the mind toward the same realization. What we call the dawn of civilization may already be the afterglow of something earlier. That is why the megaliths feel like messages. Not because they contain one hidden code that will suddenly solve itself if we become clever enough, because they embody continuity through catastrophe. Because they keep repeating the same hard truth. This was possible. This level of skill was possible. This level of coordination was possible. This level of geological and structural understanding was possible. If you no longer know how, that does not mean no one knew. I find that almost soothing. A little sad. Yes. Maybe very sad. But soothing too. It means history is not empty behind its first clear pages. It means forgetting is not total. It means some part of the old world anticipated loss deeply enough to build through it. And perhaps that was always the point. Not immortality. Durability. Not perfect remembrance. Enough remembrance that a later age would be forced to stop and wonder. Enough weight. Enough precision. Enough impossible calm in the seams that one more cycle of human beings would eventually look up from their own certainties and feel smaller, and therefore perhaps a little wiser. So let the final image be simple. A stone wall high in the Andes under evening light. A giant foundation block in Lebanon cooling after the sun has gone. A shattered andesite form on the Bolivian plain with wind moving around it like breath. A basalt seam above the Pacific. A buried coastline somewhere under dark water that no map of the ancient world ever had the chance to keep. And across all of it, one long continuity of effort, interruption, inheritance, reverence, and forgetting. The source never asks us to choose comfort over wonder. It asks for something gentler. Sit with the weight. Listen to the pattern. Let the old stones remain difficult. Let them keep refusing the small story. Let them suggest that civilization is older, more cyclical, and more breakable than we were taught. Let them remind us that what survives is not always the beginning, and what looks primitive from a distance may be the remnant of a very late mastery seen after its world has already gone dark. The fire has burned low now. The room is quieter. Outside, whatever weather is moving over the present world will continue without caring what the ancient stones still imply. But the stones will continue too, patient as ever, waiting in mountains, plains, islands, deserts, and beneath the sea line of memory, waiting for one more generation to notice that history may not start where the textbooks open, and that the oldest walls on earth are still, in their own heavy, silent way, trying to tell us so. Good night,